So the ICCA consortium, as you know, you can imagine the diversity culturally in this global alliance. People who had this common denominator of a deep political commitment to protect the biodiversity and ecological integrity of their territories, and to use these domestic and international moves to do that, but with quite different experiences of and perspectives on what conservation is, what development is, and so on. Some people did not like the term development. A lot of people didn't like the term development. Some were saying, we'll decide what development is for us. And others said, no, you can't use that word at all because it's just got too much baggage. We got to ditch development. So that was one disagreement. And another disagreement was conservation. For some peoples, conservation was a good thing. Again, it was going to have to be community-based. They would define it. But for others, conservation was too badly compromised. They had been victims of conservation agendas which had booted them off their territories, for example, and they just didn't want anything to do with conservation. So, you know, it was a little bit problematic. The indigenous peoples and local community conserved territories and areas. Initially, it was just protected areas that they were thinking about, but then conserved territories and areas was more palatable because a lot of people didn't want a cookie cutter approach where they would protect certain precious parts of their territory and then the rest was open for exploitation. That didn't really satisfy anyone. Everybody wanted to think about their whole territories as conserved territories, even if there were other things going on that might go under the banner of development. So it was very interesting, and this has really just come together in the last 4 or 5 years. And I think it's been a kind of to some extent, a conversation with the ontological turn in not just anthropology, but cultural geography. And it also very influential in all of this has been a sort of Elinor Ostrom's approach to common property. Common property governance is really integral to these people's concepts of how their territories should be run as a common resource. A common resource is another problematic word, but the shared and ecological heritage or cultural ecological heritage, biocultural diversity, socio-ecological integrity, relationality. Socio-ecological relationality is the kind of what they've come through many conversations to this idea that kind of relationality is at the core. And someone came up with the term, well, these are territories of life. There was probably a little discussion about whether it's territories for life or territories of life, but they pretty much have settled on the of preposition. So territories of life, which now has kind of melded with the conceptual charter of Instead and Cicada. We understand that complex that we started to model over 10 years ago with collective life projects embedded in territorial relationalities and requiring various forms of defense as part of the life project, so a legal strategy, an economic strategy, a self-government strategy, an interpeoples alliance strategy. We're really talking about the same thing. We're talking about territories of life. So then the problem, to distill it in that way, the problem is to multiply, is to proliferate viable territories of life on a global scale. We need to go from 30 to 300 to 3,000 and basically to a proliferation of islands of sanity in socio-ecological terms that develop sufficiently robust strategies for defense and for resurgence, that they actually transform institutions at the core of the global system of market and governance. Yeah, that's our angle. So we then have the problem. Well, how do you then directly address those inconvenient macro structures? Because so much of political agency for secular modernity, or people who occupy urban secular modernity, the problems are, well, of course they're lived at a local level, but the political imagination is about transforming these larger structures. And so how do we work from both ends, if you like, of the global to local, local to global dynamic? I think that the history of the Crees of EUistcy, as they now call their territory, early in this saga that began with Hydro-Quebec, largely began with Hydro-Quebec intrusion onto Cree lands. They were called the Crees of Northern Quebec, but of course they, for very good reasons, they say, why not our own territorial designation? And of course it is not only contained by Quebec. There were EUistcy, which can be translated as Cree land at one level, includes a big chunk of James and southeastern Hudson Bay in the jurisdictions of Nunavut, and now in the jurisdiction of Nunavut, but still significantly under federal jurisdiction. It includes a piece of northeastern Ontario, which of course was not part of the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement because Ontario was not a party to those negotiations. There's certainly some historical occupation and use even into Labrador. So the Crees of EUistcy have had this really interesting history over 50 years now, which I would say has transformed Quebec society and transformed Canadian society in some important ways. It has not brought about hasn't brought about an end to capitalism, hasn't brought about an end to the state, but it's very interesting to see how, to stabilize themselves, the Quebec and Canadian regimes have had to accommodate a growing phenomenon of Cree power at economic and political and legal levels. The state has been transformed by that activism. And I wouldn't say it's gone far enough, but it is a lesson in how local activism can be transformative of macro structures. So that's the hope, you know. How do we think about that in terms of for CICADA, it's Indigenous peoples. For the ICCA consortium, it's Indigenous peoples and other local communities or peoples who have a similar kind of engagement with, commitment to that kind of politics. How do we learn from one another under various conditions? The North and the South look quite different in some ways. The Crees have had the benefit of being members of relatively wealthy economy that has been able to offer economic justice in a certain form. It remains a kind of a collective capitalist form in as we're seeing, not just in the Cree case, but you know, when you look at the kinds of negotiations that are being done around fossil fuel extraction, around pipelines, around industrial forestry, we're seeing a particular form of a kind of community or communal approach to capturing revenues from resource extraction, which on the one hand is encouraging in terms of economic empowerment and political empowerment to a degree, but not necessarily in conformity with a relational ontology. And that, I think, is a really interesting moment for many Indigenous groups as they become more empowered under these circumstances. Can they actually do something different and creative, or will the measure of power increasingly be capture of capital without really transforming the logic of economic growth, of an incremental, if not rampant, extractivism? And I think there's room for optimism where Indigenous communities are concerned, because of the cultural proclivity for environmental stewardship. The certain values on territory that mean, at the very least, that the calculus of how much of our territory should be under strict protection is quite different from a Cree at, let's say, Waswanipi in northern Quebec from a Montrealer. I think the political will is different. But the jury is still out on whether the economics of consumerism and the cant of development through perpetual growth will bring Crees down along with everyone else. In a real way, in a real sense now, I think we are facing the same problem. Crees may be able to show us a way out a little more easily than we can find within our own systems, because they still have a kind of an engagement with territory which is really visceral. Everybody has members of the family for whom their connection with the land is still the most important value in life. But they've also got their entrepreneurs and their politicians for whom power comes from doing deals with corporations. And so how those influences get balanced out or reconciled or not reconciled, but in some kind of continuing tango, is different from the dynamic in the South. Then if you look at the global South, many of our partners there have no hope of economic justice in these terms. And so interestingly, they are, of course, they've got nothing to gain, or they've got much less to gain from doing deals with Canadian gold mining companies or Chinese hydrovia, hydro work projects. And so they become much more determined to simply reject development in any conventional sense. And you get that discourse of it's not about development at all. It's about alternatives, real alternatives to development. And that's a very interesting conversation that goes on between the indigenous members of Cicada. When you get people from Mexico, Panama, Guatemala talking about political strategy, it's really interesting. The Latin American indigenous leaders, without many of them with very little institutional education in politics or law, are extremely astute about power, because it's, for them, it's life or death. Literally, we've had members of a few of the communities we work with over the past decade have been assassinated for resisting unwanted development on their territories. And so there's a powerful incentive to self-educate under those circumstances, and I think, and I see this also in the ICCA consortium, or what will probably eventually be called the Territories of Life Consortium. There's a similar kind of dialogue across the quite radical differences from north to south in terms of what's conceivable, what's practical under different legal and state, in general, state regimes.